So as I said, Buddhism has always emphasized impermanence and insubstantiality. In fact, so much so that it doesn't really make sense to talk about things. The world isn't a collection of separate things that occasionally interact with each other, but what you really have is a confluence of processes. And those processes are dependent on lots of other processes. That's what insubstantiality means. Nothing has any self-existence. So what about Buddhism itself? Does that apply to Buddhism? Is Buddhism what the Buddha said, or what the Buddha began? It's interesting the way that as Buddhism spread into many different cultures, we think of China, Tibet, Japan, of course, and others, it didn't just impose itself on the local culture, but it engaged in a kind of interaction, what Joanna Macy calls mutual causality. So it didn't just contribute something, it was itself affected by moving to that culture. There was a kind of mutual accommodation, learning from each other. So for example, our tradition is one of the great examples of it. The Buddha never taught Zen, or Chan, the original Chinese name, right? Chan was the result of the way that Mahayana Buddhism interacted with Chinese culture. Confucianism, and especially Taoism, many deep affinities there. And that evolved into Chan and then Zen in Japan. So it raises this interesting question, now that Zen or Buddhism generally is coming to the West or to the US or to the world generally, because it's now really a global civilization, how is it being changed? Yeah, Buddhism certainly has something important to contribute, but it's also going to be changed by that process. And in some ways, it seems like that may be the greatest challenge that Buddhism has ever faced, coming to a now global civilization. That's so different from anything else. It's not only materialistic, consumerist, secular, but frankly, it also seems to be a civilization that's self-destructing. Those of you who follow what's going on with the climate crisis and indeed the larger ecological crisis maybe have some sense of that. So what does that mean? What does that mean for Buddhism? Well, there's two things. As I said, what does Buddhism have to offer that can help us understand and respond to the particular kind of tradition that we find ourselves in today? But also, what does that mean for how we understand and practice Buddhism today? There's a number of ways that Buddhism is interacting with Western culture, but the one that I want to focus on today is dealing with not just the climate emergency, but the larger ecological crisis. And one term that's recently developed to refer to this is Ecodharma. As far as I know, the first person to use this term was Guyapati, a teacher in the Triratna tradition of England, who has started this Ecodharma Center in northeast Spain. But as you may know, we've also got an Ecodharma Center here in Boulder County that we just started just a couple years ago. And if you're interested, I can tell you more about that later. But Ecodharma is so new, this term, this concept is so new that we're still, a lot of people, wondering what does it mean? Or more precisely, what do we want it to mean? How do we understand it? And what I want to talk about today are the three aspects that, at least so far, stand out for me. The three characteristics that I, at least for the moment, emphasize. And these are, first of all, practice in the natural world. secondly, looking at the Buddhist teachings and trying to see what they have to say specifically about our situation, which is a bit of a challenge because, of course, there was no ecological crisis at the time of the Buddha. This wasn't something he ever talked about. Right? We can search through all the Buddhist texts, the Pali Canon, the Mahayana Sutras. We're not going to find any important references there that can help us specifically about what to do. But we can extrapolate. There are a lot of very interesting, suggestive sorts of things. And I'll mention one in particular that seems important to me. What does this mean? What does Ecodharma, what does our ecological situation mean for how we understand the Bodhisattva path today? Or as some people talk about, the Ecosattva path. Yeah. In some ways, I wonder if this is the most important thing that Buddhism may have to offer today, this notion of the Bodhisattva or Ecosattva path applied to the particular kinds of challenges that we face today. But I'll come to that. So let me just say a little bit about all three of these, or each of these three things. And practice in the natural world. It's really interesting that, as far as we can tell from the traditional mythologies about the Buddha's life, he had this thing for trees. Right? He was even born among trees, supposedly, when his mother went into premature labor in Lumbini Grove, right? There's a famous story, not so well known, where he was, as a child, he was sitting outside under a tree when his father was doing some ritual plowing. And he sort of spontaneously went into a kind of a samadhi, some kind of contemplative trance, just sitting under the tree, not even trying. Just sort of something happened to him there, which he supposedly later remembered. When he left home in his spiritual quest, where did he go? Out into the forest, where he studied with two teachers, did his ascetic practices, and then started meditating again in the forest. And it's believed that he had his great awakening under a Bodhi tree beside a river. And even after that, what did he do? He continued mostly to live outside. Most of his teachings were done outside. And according to the Mahaparinibbana Sutra, he actually died between two trees as well. Interesting. This special relationship. So maybe it's not surprising that he seemed to have a real appreciation for trees and comparable things. There's a famous story where the spirit of a tree once appeared to him in a dream and complained that one of the monks had cut down its tree in order to make a little kuti to live and meditate in. So the Buddha, in the morning, he gathered the Sangha together and he made a rule. Monastics aren't allowed to cut down living trees, or even lop off a living branch, or even pluck a green leaf from a bush. But I think the implications of this life spent outside are much deeper than that. Today, in Zen, as in most of the other Buddhist traditions, we spend most of our time meditating in rooms like this or the one next door, the Zendo. Four-cornered, much more comfortable. You can control temperature and wind and insects and all that. For sure more comfortable, but we may also wonder, is something lost? The fact that we spend all our time inside. And it's not just the Buddha. I'm thinking of Milarepa, and so the tradition of, or the Thai forest tradition. And again, it's not just Buddhism. Think about Jesus. What did Jesus do after John the Baptist baptized him? Anybody remember? 40 days and 40 nights by himself in the desert. actually, now that I think about it, going back, Moses. Think about him going off by himself up into the mountains, seeing the burning bush and getting the tablets. Later on, Muhammad, right? He was inspired. He received the verses of the Quran. He would go off to a cave by himself. What's going on there? Why is it that for so many people, for so many of these great spiritual figures, something powerful happened to them when they were out in the natural world? What's so important about the natural world? Well, one thing that stands out for me is the way that in our usual lives, in urban settings, or even just in very attractive rooms like this one, we're basically seeing the world in a certain kind of way. Let me try to say it differently. When we grow up, what happens? We learn to see the world in the way that other people do. Mm-hmm. We sort of buy into a particular perspective. And it's not just a worldview, it's actually our perceptions. And a lot of that has to do with language. Right? Learning a language is learning to see the world in a particular way, including, if you think about it, so much of language is identifying things. And in the process of identifying them, then we know how to use them. Right? It's like, for most of us in urban or comfortable situations like this, we look around and what do we see? Well, I see a cup. Well, I know what a cup is for. Right? I see the stand, I know what that's for. I see a table. I see a book. Tissues. It's like learning a language is learning to not just identify these things, but to see the world as a collection of utensils to be used in certain ways. Everything is a means to the ends of our comfort. Everything is a way for us to satisfy our desire or do something. And this is built into us in a very deep way. In other words, collectively, we've bought into this construction so that we see the world in the way that other people do, and it's a very utilitarian way. In a way, we're kind of trapped into it. This is the construct, and it's very hard to let go of that construct and see the world freshly, which is why going out, especially by oneself into the natural world, there could be something very powerful about that. First of all, by yourself, you're letting go of language. You're not talking the way I am. You're not relating to each other. You can talk to a tree, but if you talk to a tree like I'm doing, it ain't going to work. So it encourages us to let go of language. It encourages us to let go of our usual utilitarian way of always relating to the world and seeing afresh. We enter into a living community. Trees, stream, grasses, rocks, bushes, whatever. But in the process, it can help us let go of ourselves because we're letting go of language and those habitual ways of identifying and using everything. So that's why I think meditation in the natural world can be very powerful, very transformative, and that's why it's a very important part of our Ecodharma Center up in past Jamestown. We do have a nice place where people can sit inside, but what we really have is beautiful, wonderful paths where people can go and find a comfortable place and meditate. And let go. Let go of the usual way of always identifying and using things, and thereby letting go of ourselves. So that's the first aspect of Ecodharma. The second one is looking at traditional Buddhist teachings and seeing what they have to offer, specifically that can help us with the ecological crisis, which requires extrapolation, because as I said, they don't necessarily, you're not going to get specific advice there, or that's going to be very helpful about what to do. But nonetheless, there's a lot of Buddhist teachings that, for me, have very interesting implications. And one in particular that stands out for me that I'll talk about just a tiny bit is what I see as a fascinating parallel, extraordinary parallel, between what I think traditional Buddhism is saying about our usual individual predicament, our dukkha suffering, delusion, what the source of that is, and the parallel is with our collective predicament today. By collective, I mean our species, our now global civilization in relationship to the biosphere. In fact, I'm so much struck by this parallel that I wonder if we can say it's the same problem in microcosm and macrocosm. What do I mean? Well, of course, there's different ways of trying to articulate what Buddhism is saying, but and historically, for some people, the Buddhist path is a way to transcend or escape this world, to go to Nibbana, which is evidently some other dimension or some other reality. And more in our time, watered down Buddhism is encouraging us to simply see the challenge as sort of letting go of the rough edges of our ego and fitting in better into the world so that we harmonize with it better. But in fact, both of those, I think, miss the real point of the Buddhist path, right? The fundamental problem, as I would express it, is the delusion of a separate self, the delusion of a duality between myself, somewhere in here, behind the eyes, inside the ears, and all of you and the rest of the world out here. As I see it, this is the fundamental delusion, the fundamental issue at the core of our problem. And again, it goes back to that conditioning I spoke of earlier, that as we grow up and we learn to see the world in the way that everyone else does, there's a construction. We're buying into a construction. And part of that construction, of course, is the construction of a sense of me inside and the construction of an objective external world outside. So the construction, at the core of this construction, is this duality. And we can understand the individual path as letting go of ourselves, as the great Zen Master Dogen talked about it, to forget ourselves. So it's not about transcending the world, or if it's transcendence of the usual way of understanding the world. Rather, it's about opening up, right? Opening up to the mystery, opening up so that we feel less sense of separation, so that we cut through this delusion that my well-being is separate from the well-being of all of you, and I can pursue my own well-being separate from yours. Right? Because as long as we have this delusion of a separate self, this constructed self is inherently insecure, inherently uncomfortable. Because it's not real. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of acting. And because it's not real, it's always going to experience what I like to call a sense of lack, a sense of something missing. Right? Our usual sense of self is haunted or shadowed by this sense of lack, the feeling that something is wrong with me, I'm not good enough. Anybody familiar with that feeling? The funny thing is, whenever I talk about this sense of lack, We all feel it, but we don't know it, that everyone else feels it. We think it's our own individual problem. And it can be really liberating just to realize, no, everyone feels it. It's kind of built into the human condition. It's the other side of this sense of separate self. So, without going into great detail, my way of articulating what this Buddhist path is about is letting go of the sense of separate self and opening up to the world. To realize what? Well, as my teacher Yamada Koen used to say many times, in fact, this is what supposedly precipitated his own great awakening, yeah? When he heard he was reading Dogen, who was quoting another Chinese master who said, I came to realize clearly that mind is nothing other than rivers and mountains and the great wide earth, the sun and the moon and the stars. Can we realize that? Can we realize that's our true nature? That's the challenge of our path, or one way of articulating it. That's all about the individual path. But what I'm struck by is the parallel, as I said, with our collective situation today. Because isn't it the same? As a species, as a now global civilization, don't we have this sense of separate self, collective self, that we feel we're separate from the rest of the earth. And the earth is just there, something objective, external, for us to exploit and use in any way we want. And in a way, we can understand the whole of the ecological crisis as following from that delusion and what that delusion has led to, the way that we relate to the earth, because we have that fundamental sense of separation. All of which suggests that the ecological crisis is also a spiritual crisis, that somehow at the core of it, at the heart of it, is our relationship with the biosphere, with the totality of the natural world. On the individual level, I said a moment ago that when we feel separate from the world, we're haunted by this sense of lack. Is there something comparable? Does our global civilization have a comparable collective sense of lack? And frankly, I think that we do. One way to express it is looking at our preoccupation with economic growth and technological development. It's very interesting. Think for a minute. When will our global or national GDP, GNP, when will it be big enough? Funny question, isn't it? Because we know it can't ever be. It's the nature to keep growing. But here's my question. Why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? Why is more and more always better if it's never enough? What's going on? It's like economic growth gives you resources, and it can be really good to do something. But in other words, it's a great means for some other ends, but what's happened is it's become our ends. It's just, the logic is just never enough, more and more, with no end. So I wonder if that's an expression of our collective sense of lack somehow. That's why people feel happy when the stock market is going up, and people feel so sad when the stock market goes down. You wonder what that symbolizes.
Sounds like an addiction habit.
Addiction, good. Yeah. So maybe we can call that our collective civilizational addiction. It's interesting. If I've thought about this, Supposing some aliens were up in invisible spaceships and they were watching us, and they couldn't understand our language, so they weren't interested in what we said. They just observed what was happening. What do you think they would conclude about the nature of our civilization? What's important, just in terms of what we do to the earth?
Parasitic.
Sorry?
Parasitic.
Parasitic, cancerous. It's just sick. Yeah. So just as on the individual level, so we have to, our path is about opening up to our non-separation from others and from the world. So it seems to me on the collective level, it's not enough just to I guess this is what I want to say. Whenever someone wants to talk about climate change, I actually want to emphasize that's just the tip of the iceberg, that we also need to, there's something much bigger going on, right? If you look at extinction event, we're now in the world's Earth's sixth extinction event. The renowned Harvard biologist D.O. Wilson predicted that by the end of this century, half of all plant and animal species could be extinct or will become extinct soon thereafter because they're so weakened. Half. What's going on? And especially, what does that mean for a tradition like Zen, where we take vows every day to work for the awakening of all sentient beings? What are we doing? And then you think of all the toxins in the air, in the water, in the ground, in our bodies. You think of plastics. You think of the oceans being fished out, et cetera, et cetera. We have something much bigger than just a climate crisis, urgent though that is. It's a fundamental challenge to our whole civilization and the way that we've been relating to the natural world, which it seems is only going to be resolved when we realize the sense in which we are a part of the natural world. We are an expression of it. So it's not enough simply to change from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy like wind or solar. Urgent, important as that is. I mean, people might think, oh, if we just do that, we can keep on going the way we've been doing. It ain't so simple. Yeah. There's a more fundamental challenge. And the question one of the questions I want to leave you with is, again, if that's true, please think, what does our tradition, what do our great Buddhist traditions, where do they fit in here? What do they have to offer in response? I think that's kind of fundamental koan for all of us today. Yeah. And in a way, what I'm doing today is giving you one perspective on that. So that's number 2. Briefly, number 3. What does all this mean for how we understand the Bodhisattva path? Or, in part, what is now sometimes being called the Ecosattva path. And as I said earlier, in some ways I wonder if this is the most important thing that Buddhism has to contribute, because what stands out for me about the Bodhisattva, Ecosattva path is that those who are on this path, they have a double practice or a two-sided practice. On the one hand, we continue our own personal practice and personal transformation like we're doing during this session. That continues to be as important as ever. But at the same time, we realize that that in itself is not sufficient. Individual personal transformation is insufficient without also applying that, as it were, to the larger social challenges. And this is a big step for the Bodhisattva path, because traditionally in Asia, it was usually understood on the individual level, helping individual people, especially helping other people wake up. But now, of course, we face what most of us recognize as structural problems as well, institutional problems, which is something harder to address. Right? A lot of the dukkha suffering, a lot of the delusion is sort of baked into our social and economic system. How do we address that? In the last few years, I've spent a fair amount of my time talking to groups somewhat like this, in the sense that it's Buddhist groups, and talking about why, according to my understanding, it's important for us to be engaged. And I think you can see how that follows from what I said earlier, that if the path is about opening up, letting go of our delusive sense of separation and opening up and feel our relationship, our non-duality with other people in the world, in a way you can see how the Bodhisattva path follows from that, right? We sort of wake up to some degree from our own suffering, but into a world full of suffering. And in a way, now all of that's my suffering, right? Or all of that's a challenge, something that pulls forth compassion from me. I'm reminded of one of my great quotations from a Neo-Advaitin, Nisargadatta, who put it so well. When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love or compassion. The two pillars of our path, wisdom, compassion. And what I love about that quotation, it becomes clear what's the relationship between them. I remember my teacher saying, Yamada Koen, saying, a genuine kensho is accompanied with the spontaneous arising of compassion. And of course the challenge today is always for all of us, given the earth-shattering, world-destructing challenges that we face today, what's the best way for our compassion to manifest, right, in response? So, I spent a lot of time talking to Buddhists why it's important to get engaged, but it works the other way around too. That, as we know, to be an activist today, and I'm so inspired by the XR stuff in London. I don't know if any of you have been watching that, the Extinction Rebellion actions in London. But to be an activist is pretty exhausting. It's really hard to avoid burnout, frustration, despair. But how much of a difference it can make if your activism is grounded in a kind of spiritual, contemplative practice. You see. How wonderful to bring those two together, to ground our activism, our compassion, our compassionate activities in the kind of spiritual path that gives us the serenity, the equanimity, the emptiness, whatever you want to call it, that therefore gives us that ground from which we can therefore go out. I have to say, I've realized there's a lot of resistance among a lot of Buddhist communities, right? This isn't traditional, it's not really Buddhism. Leave me alone. When I'm fully enlightened, then maybe I'll want to do something like that. It's like there's a fair amount of resistance in the Buddhist world to wanting to get off our butts and get engaged, because engagement, it's tough, and it does seem like a distraction, but maybe this is the point. We've been thinking of practice as what happens on our cushions, and thinking of engagement as a distraction from that. But what happens if we understand both of them as practice? Transformative. In fact, both of them as transformative personally. I remember my early days when I was living in Hawaii, where I started, we had the Maui Zendo. It was pretty intense. It wasn't that difficult. Insights, things happened. But always the greater challenge was going out and actually integrating whatever insights were happening into how I actually related to other people. That was much harder, a lifelong challenge, right? Reminding me that the one who is most changed by activism in the world is the person who does it. Again, if we approach it as part of our practice, right? Maybe in Zen, for example, we might have an opening, what sometimes was called a kensho. There might be some opening. Well, most kensho are pretty, they're not earth-shattering, except maybe for a few moments, right? So, kensho doesn't mean that our our habitual ways of thinking, feeling, relating to other people, those traditional ways don't automatically disappear because you've had a kensho, right? They are still there, but the kensho gives you sort of more of a handle or more of a sense of how they can be transformed. But our usual self-preoccupied, self-centered ways of relating to the world, they're still, they continue. They return. So, how do you actually transform those deeply rooted habitual ways of relating to other people, how do you actually transform it? You go out into the world and start to live in a less self-preoccupied, more compassionate way, which to me is one definition of activism, which is why I'm trying to say I think the activism can be a really, really important, necessary part of our path, especially these days where we can't escape these challenges. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm.
Let me finish by saying one more thing about the Bodhisattva or Ecosattva path that really stands out to me. And I think it's something that is only possible because, or if, when we are grounded in some kind of contemplative practice. There's a lot of things one can say about the Bodhisattva path, but in particular, Bodhisattvas, Ecosattvas act without attachment to the results of their actions. And that, it seems to me, is really, really important, especially with activism, because we don't know the results, right? In fact, a lot of the time what we do, it doesn't work, right? There's a lot of frustration. We face, I love the way that Zen Peacemakers talks about don't know mind. The truth is we don't really know what's happening. We don't really know what's possible. We don't know what's coming in the future. It looks grim, but we don't really know how it's going to play out or when. But what does that mean for us? I think it means this. To be an Ecosattva is to do the very best we can, not knowing if anything we do makes any difference whatsoever. And that's okay. That's more than okay. That's our life. And that non-attachment to results is what that ability is what we develop in this practice. Let me say it again because I think it's so important. Our task is to do the best we can, not knowing whether our best is going to make any difference. Right? We don't act out of hope or despair. Maybe that's another way of saying the same thing. Hope and despair, it's interesting. There's a kind of duality between them, the way we can bounce back and forth. You read something in the newspaper that's very hopeful, this is happening, and then you read how bad things are going so much more quickly than anybody expected, and you despair, and how easy it is to bounce. We're talking about a path that's beyond hope and despair. For me personally, it's about facing my grief at what's happening and what is likely to happen, and maybe it's funny to say it this way, the grief can be very healing in the sense that it can cut through a lot of bullshit. You know, that grief, oh my God, wow, a lot of ego bullshit and a lot of our petty kind of day-to-day stuff. And then it can liberate us to sort of, okay, I don't know how it's going to play out, but I know that I'm here now and I'm called to act in a certain way. And I think that call is genuine. I think insofar as we open up, we are called by the earth. The earth wants us. The earth is asking us. In a way, our activities are our gift to the earth. But of course, we're part of the earth. So it's, in a way, it's our gift to ourselves. Paul Hawken talked about this as the immune system. Our bodhisattva activities could be understood as the immune system of the earth responding to the kind of crises that we're facing today. And I think that's true. I think that's what we're all called upon. Let me just finish by saying that if we are not willing or able to respond to that call as Buddhists, let me just say, if Buddhism as traditions and Buddhists individually, if they're not called upon to respond to this, to become Ecosattvas, if they don't feel that tug, then maybe Buddhism isn't what the world needs right now. And to be honest, that's still, I'm not sure, because when I go around talking, there's a lot of indifference, there's a lot of resistance to this among Buddhists. So I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but what I've tried to talk about today is to share with you some of the ways in which I think Buddhism, this wonderful path that we're on, has something really important to offer that can help us understand and respond to our situation today. Thank you.